We're good to go, Brian, whenever you are.
Okay.
I was going
Is
to
it,
move round.
is it rolling or not? Okay.
Move round a bit.
Okay.
Or kind of.
Welcome everybody to our next Everyone Can Write course. The structure of today is that for somewhere in the region of up to an hour, I will be boring you really to pieces. And then we start doing a couple of exercises. We go on to the next phase in which you actually do quite a bit of writing. But in order to tell you about it, I need to give you some background as to how I reached here. And when I say everyone can write, I mean everyone can write. I have yet to find somebody who can't. This doesn't mean that everybody can write like, as the next phase is how to write like Shakespeare. Mm-hmm. What it is that everybody that I've ever come across can tell a story, a good story. And then every now and then you hit somebody who really knows how to use words. But you know, that's something else. So, a long time ago, I was teaching at Lambda, and I was walking down the passageway at the end of one term, and the principal, whose name was Roger Croucher, stopped me and said, would you do a term on Greek tragedy next year? And sort of making the mistake of thinking this was some sort of suggestion. I said, Roger, I know absolutely sod all about Greek tragedy. And he said, well, then you've got 12 weeks to learn. So I set off to learn about Greek tragedy. And that was, I have to say, a bit of an eye-opener, because there are walls full of books written by professors of quite high standing about Greek tragedy. And then halfway through, I suddenly realized that, in fact, they were all basing this on 3 or 4 holes in the ground at the bottom of the Acropolis, where there was an original theatre, and the wooden poles that had held it up just left the holes in the ground, and then a few things on various pots, quite a lot of them broken, and something in Aristophanes where he talks about the plays. And really that's all anybody knows about Greek tragedy, apart from obviously the plays themselves. Nobody knows, but they write these books and they say, this is how it was done, that's how it was done, and actually they are sucking it out of their thumb. Mm-hmm. They don't know, they're guessing. Anyhow, so I staggered my way through this, and I had this real problem with Aristotle's definition of tragedy, because I couldn't really understand it. I'm sort of not an intellectual, and I ended up really thinking, I have no idea what this is all about. And I was about to sort of commit suicide and not go into the next term when I found Augusto Boal's book, Theatre of the Oppressed. And in it he has a whole chapter which is called Aristotle's Coercive Theory of Tragedy. I'm hugely admiring of Augusto Boal and the system that he set up for doing really practical theatre which helps communities. But like other people, like Brecht, etc., who are political writers, they quite frequently throw the baby out with the bathwater. They don't ever seem to understand that what they're talking about is just the system. It's a system like we're sitting here and there's lights on, which is lovely. But over there on the wall is a plug, stick your finger in that and you're dead. But it's what's causing the light. Every system is just used for one thing or the other. And a lot of political writers just sort of, and so Aristotle's Coercive Theory of Tragedy, which he wrote as though Aristotle had set up the rules and then all the playwrights had written the plays according to Aristotle's rules, which slightly ignores the fact that Aristotle lived about 200 years after all the main playwrights. However, it did very clearly and very succinctly tell me what the whole Aristotelian thing was about. And I ended up thinking, oh, I see. It's not this incredibly complex thing that they talk about. It's simple. There are these 4 stages, and that's that. So, I set off to teach them all about the Greek theory, tragedy. And it was a lovely term. We worked our way through. They're actors. Actors like to act. You find that out very early if you're a teacher. And so what you mustn't do is keep them sitting around. And so what I would do is I took various versions of Antigone, because there are millions of versions of Antigone, and I took the original. I took Henri's one that he did in the Second World War. I took Brecht's one, which he used after the Second World War, and I took Athelfugard's The Island, in which he uses one of the final scenes of Antigone, one of the big scenes as part of that. And what we would do was we would go through the structural thing of the play, and we would examine similar scenes in all these to see what the various playwrights did. So I had really happy days, and got to the end of the term, and about 3 days before the end of the term, walking down the corridor, the principal passed me by and said, "Oh, seems to be going okay, take another term." I nearly committed suicide. I had everything that I knew about Greek tragedy had been told. And so I was sitting there thinking, oh God, now what am I going to do? And then it also occurred to me, however, that all of these young students were going to go home for Christmas. They were going to eat far too much. They were going to forget everything that they had been taught in the past term. They were probably going to smoke things that they shouldn't have. And they were generally going to have a great time. And that struck me as being unfair. So I thought that's not going to happen. So in my last class with them, I said, okay, we're going on next term. So what you're going to do over the 3 weeks when you think you're on holiday is I want you to take an issue, political or social, in the community that you come from. Because I'd found that whenever you asked anybody to do anything about that, they would pick Nicaragua or which were the big issues back then. This is in the late 80s. And I said, it's got to be in your hometown, sort of in your back garden. So you pick something there, and then what I want you to do is, using the structural things we've looked at, I want you to write a synopsis of a play based around that issue, with a set of characters, etc. And it's got to be on 1 A4, because I didn't want to slog through millions of things. And it must be just quite clear and tell us what it is. Now, I went off, and I had a really lovely Christmas. I didn't have to do any sodding work at all, and so I had a lovely time. I came back, and being the deeply depressive, cynical pessimist that I am, I thought that what I would have would be about 4 or 5 of the class SWATs, there were 27 of them, would have neatly typed, completely precise, everything that you wanted. And then about 5 or 6 of the others would have remembered the night before. Another 6 or 7 or 8 would have, at the tea break which preceded the class, have suddenly thought, we're supposed to have written something, and would have scrawled something down quickly. And then the honest ones would come in and say, sorry, forgot. To my complete stunned amazement, I got 27 fully worked out ideas for a play. It was a real stunner. Even more, there was not one duplicate story. Not one. They all used the basics. And when I'd set them, you have to use the basic template of, 2 brothers, 2 sisters, an uncle, and a lover, so that's what you've got. Write it from there. And you get all the sort of questions, which you will ask me later on in the course as well, about, do I have to? And the answer is no, you don't have to. I said, I don't actually care if you come out with 1 brother and no sisters, and uncle with a hump and a limp and looks like Richard III. So I don't care. What I don't want is Antigone set in your hometown. 27 of them. We then we voted on them, the favourite stories. They all presented their stories, we voted, and we selected 4 of them, which I then divided into to cast, and I cast them, and I spent a happy term sitting in the corner doing sod all while they happily rehearsed their scenes. And that was the start of that course, this course. Now, there's something interesting. I honestly don't know. I at one stage tried to count up, and at that stage I got to just over 700 stories that had been delivered this way, play things. They're always based on Antigone, and I still have never had a duplicate. No, why, you'd think that you would, but never have I had a duplicate. Okay. This then started developing, and I started doing it on a sort of fairly regular basis in an attempt to teach actors how to write something so that they can produce their own work. And I moved on from Lambda to Mount View, and at Mount View it started getting much bigger and working much more clearly. I developed a portion of the course which is called, with a seriousness for which I'm known, How to Write Like Shakespeare in 1 hour and 45 minutes, brackets guaranteed, exclamation mark, close brackets. And it's guaranteed because it has, it's failed twice. Once it was from a little prat at East 15 who thought that he'd have fun and just write stream of conscious, which it isn't. And when he heard what everybody else had written, he was a bit embarrassed. And then in the first of these classes, I actually came up against somebody who was incredibly left-brained. I mean, really controlled by a left brain, and she actually couldn't cope with the freedom which this gives you. She really couldn't. She hated the fact that there was a story being told, and she wasn't utterly in control of the story, and that was my other failure so far. So, that's the sort of background that we worked on. Now, at a particular stage at East 15 one day, I was doing yet again the How to Write Like Shakespeare thing, and because I'm very slow on these kind of things, I suddenly one day looked at this and thought, this is extraordinary, because they all write really good stuff. And then an extra thing came in. I had a student there who thought that he was a writer, and he'd be sitting in the corner with his little notebook in the cafe, ostentatiously writing things. And he gave me several of his writings, which were sort of verging on the illiterate. They were truly, truly bad. As you will find from me, I am in a deeply depressive state about the state of education in this country, because I've been on the receiving end of the education system now for 25 years. And somewhere around 1989, it just fell off the edge of the table. People the year before who had been incredibly lively, sparky, and had resources, suddenly, whoom, it vanished. And it got worse and worse and worse, and every year they'd say the best A-level results ever, and actually what we were receiving, and it wasn't just me, if you speak to anybody in a university anywhere, they will say the same thing. We've been receiving functional illiterates for, that's nearly 23 years. And it's really difficult. These are not people who are dumb, and it's not unintelligent, but they've been given nothing. There's something deeply wrong with our education system. So, this guy was writing this illiterate stuff. And then I had the terrible thing of having to mark his essay, because everything's a university degree thing now, they have to write essays, and I had to write a Marquis essay, and his essay was, I mean, even worse. I actually couldn't follow what he was trying to say. It was completely illiterate. About 2-3 weeks later, we do this course, and he turns out this, everything's wrong, grammar's wrong, spelling, nobody can, a lot of people can't spell, that's nothing, but nonetheless, he writes this thing in the Shakespeare thing, and this was the wake-up call for me, because he wrote perfect grammar. And neither of the other stuff that I'd seen could he even get anything grammatically correct. And I started researching that, and I found that Chomsky, the American sort of writer, intellectual, had written a thing which said that grammar is hardwired into us. And I'd remembered reading it and thinking, what do you mean? We're born as babies with good grammar? And the answer to that, as I've now discovered, is yes. Yes, we are. Because everybody writes good grammar, and I started looking through all this stuff, and at that stage I had said to people, write down what you and give it to me, but they never did. I now am vicious, okay? You have to write down and you have to send it to me because I need to collect it. But the grammar is always perfect, and that's really odd. And then also I started also noticing that as each churn of new stories came out, they were lovely. And people loved listening to them. We didn't find people falling asleep. And then somewhere along the line, I just hit this thing one day and thought, oh, good heavens, everyone can write. Everyone can write a good story. Humanity is born to write stories, to tell their story. We can all do it. What happens is that we get taught not to. We get closed down. In my case, at school, and last night at the thing, I don't know whether it was you that said it, we were talking about the expectations of a teacher. Yeah. And I at school I was, this is not a boast because I was in a huge school full of, in South African terms, Afrikaans speaking kids, and there was this tiny little group of us who were English speaking. We shared a lot of classes, but we were also alone in some of the classes, just 20 of us or something. And I was considered one of the best writers in the class. And I discovered quite early that each new teacher had his own particular, and his own, because they were all male, his own version of the kind of stories they liked. So for one, I used to write everything which had the breeze, blew through the trees, and I had a whole bunch of stuff, and somebody else liked real action stories, and so he wrote that. And then when I left school and went to the big city at a particular stage when I was about 24, I thought, actually I'd like to write. I enjoy writing, so I'd like to. And I made a really bad mistake. I bought one book and then another about how to write. And they all had the same thing. They all said the same thing. Now, how do you write? Well, you have a complete synopsis of your entire story beginning to end. You have all the characters and their character thing is written down. You have everything there ready for you. And then one day you sit down at 9 a.m. in the morning with your pad and your paper, and you stay there until blood pops out of your forehead and have lunch break, brief, and then go back. And at the end of the day at about 5, you will have anywhere from 400 to 2,000 perfectly controlled words. So I didn't have a story. I couldn't even think of a story. And I sat down at 9 one morning, and at 10:15 there was a blank page in front of me, so I gave up. I thought, okay, this means I can't write. And it was only much later, when I started writing in South Africa at the end of my time there, which was in the 70s, it was a fraught period. I'd been running a theatre. We felt failed. We felt nothing would ever change. It was not a nice time. And I used to go and have tea every day just to get away from the pressures of this theatre. And one day I started writing. I don't know, I can't even remember why. Now I have an enormous file on that book. I don't know how many words. It's probably, you know, more than a novel's worth. Now it's rubbish. It's a sort of Walter Misty-esque thing, which I think was therapeutic for me. It was an attempt to deal with that situation through fantasy. And you know, I would never publish it. You know, as a matter of fact, I'm giving my daughter instructions to burn it. You know, I don't want to, but she can. You know, and so I started writing, and I really enjoyed that. Every day I would go and sit, and I would vanish into this other world, and I didn't plan anything. It just arrived. Characters arrived, introduced themselves, and on I went. It grew and grew, and it actually, you know, it makes sense. It's not a novel that doesn't make sense. It makes sense. And that was my first introduction to the everyone can write thing. Now, I'm doing a book called Everyone Can Write, and it has a subtitle, which is How Not to Learn How to Write. And how not to learn how to write is to write with your conscious brain. If you write with your conscious brain, you will churn out rubbish, you will be boring, it won't work. So what this is all based on is all of those students who just whooshed out the stuff in 45 minutes. And bang, out would come the story. And I always said, did any of you come into the room with that story in your head? No, no ideas. And a lot of people would say that's rather weird, it's a bit strange, you know, what came out there. So that's the background to how we got to this course, now running. So the structure as we go a bit further now this morning is to introduce you to two methods of storytelling. So this is note-taking time. And I use only two. I use the basics of Aristotle, and I use Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. Okay, Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey.
Joseph Campbell.
And I do the two of them because really you only actually need Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. But
Joseph Campbell, is it?
Joseph Campbell, yeah.
Yeah, The Hero's Journey.
Yeah. Well, Joseph Campbell wrote a book called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And the Hero with 1,000 Faces is a collection of, you know, I'm in awe of Joseph Campbell. I don't know if you know who he is and what he does, but you know, there's one whole library shelf with his books: Oriental myths, Occidental myths, North mythology. I mean, he's collected every story the world has ever seen in these enormous books. I don't know how he did it, you know. And he used to lecture in America. He only died a couple of years ago. And he used to lecture, but one of the books he wrote was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces, because inside that book he calls it a monomyth. And he says there's one story that is present in every single society on the planet. In the late, in the 60s somewhere, in the days when you didn't have, well, we didn't have television, and you just watched Pathé News once a week in the cinema. One week I still remember seeing this thing about, we found the Stone Age tribe, and they were in Papua New Guinea, and they had this very long telephoto shot of these people peering out of the forest at us, and they'd found this tribe that didn't know anything about us. And had been living there in the Stone Age forever. And they went in to investigate them, and a lot of anthropologists went in as well. And in his book, Campbell talks about that and said even they had this storyline. It's the hero's journey, and it's really, the basis is the sort of Jesus story. It's about a king who sacrifices for the good of everybody else, dies and is reborn, and it's that sort of cyclical thing. But he looked through the stories, and they all had this structure of about 12 stages. So we'll be looking at, firstly, Aristotle's basic 4 things that you need in a story, and then the structure of Joseph Campbell. Okay. I generally, because I was dealing with a lot of young actors who got bored really easily, I used a book which is called The Writer's Journey by a man called Christopher Vogler. That's Vogler. Vogler was a scriptwriter and a script editor working in Hollywood, and he used to go to Campbell's lectures. It was the 60s. Everybody was interested in Campbell, 60s and 70s, and further on. And then he started looking at the scripts that he was doing and found that they all had that. And then he started teaching it to his students. He was at UCLA, I think. And then what happened is that various of his other scriptwriter friends said, "That's interesting, could you just do something for us?" So he just wrote down a thing and gave it out. And then Disney got to hear of this, and they said, would you write us a handbook for our writers? And that became, this one, which at one stage was called the Hollywood Scriptwriters Bible. Everybody used it quite frequently, very badly, and it was much copied, but that turned into the writer's journey. And what he does, and why it's so good, is that he takes famous films and then says, this is how this is there, this is that kind of character, this is that stage, this is what happens, and investigates how the various things are utilized. And it's a very good system. And now, I'm going to tell it to you, but what you must never do is write using that template. You must never sit and think, now I'm going to do this, now I'm going to do that, now that's wrong. But what you can use it for is when you've finished writing, you go back through and you look at that and think, okay, have I got all of these stages in there? It helps you to find out where you've gone wrong. And I taught it to actors over the years for the same reason. They could then look at the plays they were being given and think, this play isn't working, why isn't it working? It's because that isn't there. And quite frequently, especially with regard to one of the phases that the Aristotelian ones that we'll dwell on for a while, if that is not generally written into the play, the actor has to do it, but we'll be getting to that. Okay, so Aristotle. We go down to Aristotle. Now, Aristotle has sort of a basic 4 phases. The first one is identification. Okay, if you don't identify with the characters in a play, a novel, a film, then you don't go on the journey. It's as simple as that. So if you want people to come on your journey, then they have to be able to identify with people. If you just think of some of the things, every now and then, there was a new telly thing on the other day. I can't remember, Intruders or something. And I just watched the first thing and I thought, I hate everybody in this thing, and I stopped watching it, It's as simple as that. You have to identify. That's number 1. Now, you identify through a character trait. You think, oh, this person is nice because, and I share.
Is this number 2?
This is no. This is still number 1. You identify through a character trait. Number 2 is called, and this is so bluffy away in the local pub on Aristotle, hamartia. That's HAMARTIA. Mark is fondly remembering this. Hamartia, Ham-art-I-A. Just about everything in Greek ends in I-A, okay? Hamartia has sadly been badly translated as the fatal flaw, which is a really bad translation because it's got nothing to do with what it's about. The Greeks were all about balance. So there's that character trait that you're identifying with, and it's in balance, and then it goes out of balance, and that's what you're looking for. So that's what happens. That's the fatal flaw. It's just something going out of balance. So it drags you down the road towards this, and then you find that things are going a bit wrong. Okay, now the character trait, that can be anything. It can be anything from, for instance, pride. You know, pride is a much maligned, is pride an emotion? Really not quite sure. Anyhow,
It's an attitude, isn't it?
an attitude. Because it's good to be proud of stuff you've done. However, if you get too proud, then it tips into vanity. So that's how the one thing goes into the other. Anybody that knows me or pretends to know me will tell you that I'm incredibly passionate about what I do. And the ones who don't know me very well will tell you that that can actually tip over into really deep stubbornness. Now that's not true, but but that's a case of something going out of balance. Okay, and that's what you're looking at. So you're identifying with somebody, and then something that you identified through just tips out of balance. Okay, so now this tipping out of balance generally comes through the third thing, and this I have a thing of I'm always saying this is the most important of these four stages, and actually there's this sort of rather strange, probably defying the laws of physics in the universe, but every single one of these is the most important. Okay, and so the next most important is called Peripatea, P-E-R-I P-E-T-E, and then I-A once again, Peripatea. Peripatea translates fairly straightforwardly as reversal. And it's that moment when everything you thought you knew turns upside down. And stories, well, they can exist without it, but if they don't have it, they're not really very exciting. And if you think about any film or book or anything like that, you'll remember there was a moment when suddenly you thought, what? And it's exciting. You get slightly goose-fleshy. And it's what makes it exciting. The more peripateia you can build into your thing, the better. Now, if you want to study this very thoroughly, then you take a look at Jean Anouilh's Antigone, which is one of the great plays. But above all others, there is no other play that I'm aware of that uses peripateia, the reversal, with such absolutely consummate skill. It's really extraordinary what he does. And so you need to understand the background to what was happening. And we wrote the play in, I think it was 40 or 41, and it was going to be staged in a big theatre in Paris while the Nazis were occupying. So he was going to have, sitting in front of him in the audience, would have been the Gestapo,
Yeah.
would have been what I call the Three Monkeys audience, the Parisians who were just saying, just let it go away, I'll just close my eyes and it'll go away. Then you had the Vichy who were controlling France, and then slightly more hidden you'd have the resistance. And you see a playwright talking to four different audiences with it is just unbelievable skill, because what he does is a system of small identifications, peripateas, and reversals, and then another identification. So what he'll do is take you down the way to it, and you'll think, yes, I agree with that, and suddenly you see the consequences of your agreement, and just as you're about to think, okay, I'm out of here, I don't want this, he'll introduce something else, and you'll say, oh, no, that's okay, and then it'll take it further. Now, it was done with such skill that he was not taken off by the Gestapo. He didn't have his fingernails pulled out, and he didn't end up in a concentration camp. It's just the most amazing piece of work. And inside it, there's a 25 minute scene, I can't remember, between Creon and Antigone, which is one of the great expositions of politics, and in which you find that happening all the time as Creon seeps his way into her consciousness and almost gets her to agree with him. It's the most extraordinary scene. And that was how that's how you use it. Watching it, I mean, when I first did this course, when we were doing that first term, we finally sort of more or less lost track of the amount of, identifications and reversals. Now, that identification thing, in Aristotle's definition of tragedy, which I'm not going to go into too much now, but he has a phrase which says, you identify through pity and fear. And I didn't really understand what the hell he was talking about, but I just happened to have, in the second class that I did, a guy who, apart from being an Everton fan, which was probably, was also an MA in Greek studies and had translated, which is a little bit, daunting when you're a teacher with no knowledge of anything. But he was really good, and one day I said to him, I don't understand this, what is it? And he said, oh no, he said, what happens is people identify through pity. They sort of think, yes, I feel that way, or I'm going with that. However, then when the Peripatea arrives and things go wrong, they suddenly start being fearful that that will happen to them. And it's at that stage that you have to introduce something else to bring them back, because if they stop listening to your story, you're dead. And that made complete sense. And that is what the ennui does incredibly, because he has to keep all four of those audiences listening to him. And he does. But the extraordinary thing for me inside the play is that the message, at one stage I used to do it, I had a class of 12 people doing this, and we'd sit around and I'd say, okay, you three over there are the Gestapo, you three over there are the Vichy, you three over there, three monkeys, and you three over there are resistance. And then we'd read the scene, and each one of them would say, oh, actually that's doing that to me now. And then we go a bit further and say, oh no, I'm relaxing now. And it was actually really quite interesting watching how this worked. But the resistance people didn't have hardly any of that. And when we got to the end one day, and it was really rather emotional, the message that he was giving to the resistance was a very clear and very bleak one. He was saying, brothers and sisters, we may die, but it'll be worth it. Mm-hmm. Which is an incredible message to send out. So we have to do this, we don't have a choice. It's just extraordinary. Anyhow, so that's how those sort of set of things happen. Now, we go on and we reach stage 3, which is Anagnorisis.
It's stage 4.
This is stage 4. What the hell?
Yeah.
I always get it wrong.
Can you
A-N-A-G
A-N-A-G
N-O-R R-I-S-I-S. If they don't end in I-A, they end in I-S. Anagnorisis. Anagnorisis is another one of the most important phases, and it actually means sort of realization, understanding. And it's an incredibly important thing, because what happens is the protagonist has got to understand what they've done. And if they don't, then it doesn't work. There's really odd things happen to the audience. Okay? So, when we were doing this, we all thought that actually Antigone was the protagonist. She was the hero. But when we got to that, several people said, but she has no understanding. She has no, she doesn't come to a realization of what she's done. She just gets, she just dies. And as we discussed that, we realized that actually the protagonist was not Antigone. The protagonist was Creon. And he comes to a realization when he finally goes, do you know the basics of Antigone? What you have, let's just go through Antigone quickly. You have 2 sisters and 2 brothers. The 2 sisters are Antigone and Ismene, and the 2 brothers, I will never remember their names. However, and they don't come into it much, because what happens is that, and we will be coming back to this, because remember that the father of Antigone and all her sisters and brothers is Oedipus. So the 2 brothers end up fighting as to who's going to take over the state. Creon is sort of being Prince Regent, he's running it until one or the other takes over. And what happens is that one leaves and goes to join the Argives, and the other comes back and stays, and then they fight each other, and they meet on the battlefield and they kill each other. And what actually happens then is that Creon goes out and says, right, the one who was defending us will have a full state burial with all honors, and the one who was fighting against us will rot on the field. Nobody's allowed to bury him. He just lie there and rot to pieces. Antigone won't allow this to happen because it's her brother. So she sneaks out at night and covers him. And the second time she does this, in the meantime, when Creon hears that, he says, whoever did this is going to die. And then the second time around she gets caught, and he is faced with his prospective daughter-in-law, because she's in love with his son Haman. And obviously she's also his niece, I think, anyhow, who knows. So he has a problem, but he's already said what he's going to do, and he can't backtrack. So he works, and the elders come in and they argue with him, saying, we can't do this, we can't just do this. And so finally he comes up with this brilliant wheeze, in which he walls her up in a cave with water and food, and says, right, I've given her water, I've given her food, and if the gods want to let her free, well, then they will find a way. And a perfect political response to that. And what then happens is that Haman goes along to, his son argues with him, and then goes along to free her, which he shouldn't, but when he arrives there, she's hanged herself. So she's killed herself. And then his father arrives, they have a little bit of a battle, and in the battle, Haman gets killed. And then he goes home, and somebody's beaten him to it and told his wife, and she's hanged herself. And so the Greek robes had these little pins that held them up, so he takes the pin out and he stabs his eyes out. And then he goes off on another, I think it's at least 1, maybe 2 Greek plays led by Antigone. How can that be? She's not alive. Oh, I'm sorry. I've just suddenly done a wonderful segue in the wrong way to Oedipus. So
I was thinking about the eye.
Yeah, no,
Not that bit.
no, that happens in Oedipus. In that, he goes back, finds his wife has hanged herself, and that's it for him. And so he's left with the knowledge. The protagonists very rarely actually die, but it's not wise to be related to them. Okay, because you die. An awful lot of them die around the thing. So that's that storyline as we go through there, and as we realized that Antigone was very deliberately killed off in order to make a statement. She couldn't survive. There was no realization she could come to. We were supposed to look at that and think that is wrong. And we must do something about that, which is what really good theatre does. It introduces you to something and says, this shouldn't be happening. and what are we going to do about that? Okay, so those are then. Now, the final things are not really stages, but they go on to catastrophe. You can spell with either a K or a C, either way, and that's it really. That's the end of Aristotle. Okay, do you want to take a quick break? Or are you okay to go on to the next bit's quite long?
Up to you.
No, I'm fine. I'm going to dribble on forever. Okay?
Feeling cold, shall I?
Yeah, I don't know what to do. Oh, the top, so.
This one didn't run out of paper.